Okay, we are live, I believe.
Success.
Yep, here we are. Okay, welcome everybody. Hi, hello. We'll wait a little bit and wait for some people to show up, perhaps. Hi, hello. We'll wait a little bit for this so we don't have feedback. There we go.
Yeah, bit of an echo. There we go.
Okay. Welcome to our 6 o'clock stream every Sunday night. We are the Consent Academy, a nonprofit international educational collective originally based in Seattle, Washington. My name is Asha Leray. I am one of the co-directors of the Consent Academy, and I am joined today by Amelia, one of our newest volunteers. And I'm very, very excited to have them on today. Amelia, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us anything about yourself that you would like us all to know?
Yeah, thanks, Ash. I am Amelia, and let's see, I'm 32. I live in Washington, D.C. So I found out about the Consent Academy through a whole bunch of kind of convoluted loopholes of word of mouth mostly, and then arrived at this incredible organization just recently. Let's see. I am a drag king and burlesque performer. I'm a consent educator. That is my passion, consent and sexuality education. And that's a little bit about me to start.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Do you want to go over those convolutions of how you got to know of the Consent Academy?
Yeah, so I have been looking through, and sorry about there's a little bit of background noise. It's just my heater turning on. It's very cold in my house. I've been looking for an organization like the Consent Academy for a long time. Looking for an organization that focuses on consent first, as opposed to consent as, you know, the larger picture of sexuality. And I feel like I've come so close a few times with organizations that felt like they might be good fits, but were more on the policy side of things, or were talking about maybe teaching consent one day, but weren't quite there yet. And the Consent Academy, I think I found while I was searching Sex Positive World, which is another great West Coast based organization that does sexuality education, consent education. And if I'm not totally off base, I think it came up in a Google search, and I brought it up, and someone had heard of it in my group supervision through my certification program. And someone said, "Oh, Consent Academy, yeah, you should check them out." And all it took was one consent, not the basics, but the complex consent course for me that got me really excited about this organization in particular. I was just like, oh, I love this script. This is so good. Yeah, it's good curriculum.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's a really good point that you bring up. There aren't a lot of educations that do teach about consent specifically, and not just like as a part of like a broader sex education curriculum, but like consent first kind of. That's a little bit of our style. Like, we think consent is a part of like every part of day-to-day life, not just sex, but sex is one of the most like intense parts. So like, you really need to know it then, but how else are you going to know it if you haven't been practicing it in the rest of your life? So yeah, I was very excited that you are on board with our mission, and I was very excited to bring you on board.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess my next question for you is, what does consent mean to you?
So consent is overarching. Consent is
consent mean to you?
Sorry, there was a little bit of feedback. I got distracted.
Sorry, should be good now.
Consent is, to me, like an overarching guiding principle in life that informs everything I do, that informs my interactions. Consent is, I have this Dossie Easton definition written down that I love. It's just so simple: an active collaboration for the benefit, well-being, and pleasure of all persons involved, or all persons concerned. I don't want to misquote Dossie Easton. They're the one of the authors of The Ethical Slut. I love the idea of consent not existing in a vacuum. Consent exists in human interaction. And as social animals, we experience, we violate, we affirm, and we deny consent throughout our interactions every day. I think it's so important to bring mindfulness to that process of daily consent, or minute to minute to consent. But yeah, consent for me is, I'd call it a guiding principle.
Thank you. I really like the pleasure piece in that definition.
Me too.
Yeah. So how have issues around consent shown up in your life specifically? If you don't mind sharing.
Yeah. So I am an AFAB, assigned female at birth, human being who has grown up and been socialized in a female body. I'm non-binary. I use they, them pronouns. I don't identify as female now, but that is the way I was socialized. That is the way I've been perceived as I walk through the world. And so consent was sadly a foreign concept, or a concept I just didn't have the word for, or words for. I didn't have words to talk about consent, and I didn't have the word consent growing up and as an adolescent, and even as a young adult. I understood consent to be more in legal terms of informed consent, medical consent, but applying consent to my own life and understanding my own agency, my own autonomy, that's been kind of a more recent life development. The last, I don't know, I'd like to say 10 years, but it's probably more like 5 years, of really embracing my own agency and examining consent where I wish I'd had the education around consent growing up, where I wish that, of course, I wish that consent had been built into my public school education, sex education, which I was lucky enough to have any sex education at all, of course. But that's more broadly how issues of consent have come into my life as a socialized female person. More recently, as a drag and burlesque performer, I find that venue is a really interesting space, and sometimes a very problematic space in terms of consent. That there are a lot of consent issues within the culture and the community around drag and burlesque that I think relies a little too heavily on implied consent sometimes, or implicit consent. I find that, well, there's always the story of drag and burlesque performers being groped by audience members, and then the reverse of that, the performer themselves not valuing necessarily the consent of the audience, or considering the consent of the audience to be complicit, because you're at a drag show, you must have some understanding of the culture, you must understand, it's implied that you understand that that a drag queen might get handsy, that that you might be interacted with in a very physical way. And that I find more and more, I'm seeing more and more shows take a moment at the beginning, and burlesque has done a pretty good job around this historically, but more and more drag shows are starting to give disclaimers at the beginning about physical contact and about consent between performer and audience member, that there can be nonverbal cues that indicate a lack of consent, that like, no, thank you, indicates to a performer that maybe that is not the audience member to whom I'm giving a lap dance tonight. So yes, most recently in my life, I just had all day burlesque rehearsal today for what I like to call boylesque, which is I do burlesque and drag, and it's a lot of, can I swear on this forum? I forgot to ask.
You can swear.
Fabulous. It's my personal style of burlesque is a lot of gender fuckery. I like to, if I can, fuck with your head. Fuck with your perceptions of gender as much as I can in the span of a number. And so I was at rehearsal all day today for a show that I've got coming up next month. And we were practicing our audience interaction. And we had to have a conversation as a troupe around consent, because I will say one of our members is a cisgender male who has made some assumptions around consent in the past in terms of audience interaction. And so we had a really fruitful discussion just today about respecting boundaries, implicit and explicit boundaries, and consent in the burlesque forum.
Cool. Okay. Wow, that's fresh.
Yeah.
Okay, if you don't mind, I want to backtrack just a little bit to when you were talking about being assigned female at birth and being socialized into female gender. And you mentioned like not having as much sex education, or not having a very comprehensive sex education, and especially not a comprehensive consent education. And I just want to acknowledge what felt like some grief coming up around that, like around that coercive process around gender, and then the lack of education to like be able to put that into context until you're an adult. Like that is definitely something to grieve, I think.
Absolutely. I feel grief for, and I've done some trauma work myself in therapy, working on grieving the things that my younger self didn't know, the education my younger self didn't have, the moments of intense consent violation that I experienced, especially in the moments where I wasn't aware that no was an option. Yeah, there is tremendous grief. I think a lot of people, that's kind of a piece of going through this consent education as an adult, is grieving for your younger self and striving to educate youth who are at that point that you may have been at yourself. It just makes it feel all the more relevant and important to be doing this consent education.
And then now currently engaging in gender fuckery. I love that. um, and that way of reclaiming your agency, and at the same time seeing a lot of consent issues in the burlesque and drag community. And you mentioned a lot about implied norms and implied consent. Um, I personally have been to very few burlesque shows in my life. And I remember feeling very much like, what are the implied norms here? Like, very caught off guard, like, did not know what was appropriate, like, didn't know if it was okay to laugh, if it was okay to, like, yeah, I was just very not sure about that. Can you, to the best of your ability, speak to some of those implied consent and then implied norms that are there to just maybe give people a bit more informed consent about what burlesque and drag shows are like?
Yeah, absolutely. What I love about burlesque is the tease, the sexual play with the audience, that interplay with the audience of the joke is kind of on the audience. That is
Okay,
kind
I
of
thought so.
at the heart of burlesque, and also drag to an extent.
Mhm.
And the discomfort is part of the fun of being an audience member at a drag show or at a burlesque show. It's also part of the fun of being a performer, is making a person a little uncomfortable, pushing their boundaries, but boundaries that are not physical. I want to push your mental boundaries a little bit. I want to challenge you to feel turned on by something you've never been turned on before, or to be interested, or to be even an extreme emotion like revolted by something. That's play. That's engagement. And so I feel like you often see a smirk. You can catch a smirk on the faces of performers doing drag and burlesque. And to me, it's kind of the fun of the joke or the trick. We're playing with the audience. We're playing with your sexual desires. We're playing with your perceptions of gender and sexuality, and the norms in that space are, so there's classical burlesque, which is you might picture fans and sequins and peep shows, and there's a set of norms around that has shifted a bit with more modern kind of variety show style burlesque. But some of those norms are the look but don't touch, the peaks of silliness, and what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that there's an interplay with the audience that is meant to create a little bit of discomfort, because we are doing something body or lewd or sexual, or all three of those things, in a public space in front of an audience. It's meant to defy social norms. Mm-hmm. And so there's the discomfort you feel of whether I laugh, or whether it's okay to throw money at this person. Even like at the beginning of a show, at the beginning of my shows these days, we don't want to be handing money hand to hand. So instead we say, crumple it up and throw it at the stage. Mm. And that results in occasionally someone getting hit between the eyes. It has happened. But yeah. all of that feeds into this fun kind of discomfort, this boundary pushing discomfort.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing is when you show up to a drag show or a burlesque show, you are implicitly consenting to being uncomfortable, to having your boundaries stepped on and maybe pushed a little, and into that uncomfortable space, but they're not looking to violate you. They're looking to like make you think about why are these norms in place in the first place, or um, is this person in front of me making me uncomfortable, or is it the idea of what kind of act they're doing or gender performance that they're putting on, and the contradiction that I'm seeing right now, is that what's making me uncomfortable? So like having an intense physical response sometimes, but like mainly because your mental schemas around things are being challenged.
Very well put. Precisely. Yes.
I got that from you.
Yes.
um, that's really cool. That's really cool. I see why you're interested and have been a part of it.
Fun. It's like I feel, how do I put it? I feel like I'm playing with the audience when I'm performing. Like I am playing a little trick on the audience with my show.
So yeah, you also have to consent to being the butt of a joke a little bit.
Little bit.
A little bit.
More than a little bit in a lot of mainstream drag, I will add. That being an audience member, particularly being somewhere near the front of a drag show, often means you might get roasted at a drag show. There's I have seen some deer in headlights moments of people who were not ready to be at the front row of a drag show. Like it's like sitting at the front row of a comedian's show, or you know, a performance like that with audience interaction, where yeah, the boundaries are going to get pressed. They're going to get pushed.
And maybe also if you sit in like an aisle seat, you might expect a bit of that too.
Absolutely. And something I appreciate as a performer. So of course, I don't know everyone in my audience, but I have a sense of the communities that are showing up for my shows. And I know a lot of faces. I will recognize a lot of faces in my audience. And thankfully, I'll occasionally even have somebody who I know, okay, this person is game. This person's ready to play. This person will engage with me in a funny and ridiculous way if I engage with them. And those people tend to position themselves on the aisles at drag shows and in the front rows. We performers really appreciate that. We really appreciate the audience member who's there to play along. Yeah, but again, it's we're here to push and step on and play with boundaries and play in a somewhat risque, unsafe space without turning it into consent violations. Without, yeah, that's that crucial difference between a bit of kind of edge play as performers and violation.
So it's a little bit of high risk, high reward.
Yes. Yeah, I love that.
So then my next question is how is there accountability? Like, is there any opportunity for follow-up if people are like, well, that just really was not okay? Like, is there any kind of like in the moment back and forth, or is that something that has to come after?
So that happens in a couple of ways. I'm a member of a troupe, and as a troupe, we can hold each other accountable. And that's kind of something that happened today, even when we had a discussion about audience interaction and what's boundary pushing and fun and edgy, and what's trampling a boundary and moving into a consent violation. Burlesque shows and drag shows often start with, or truly believe should start with a disclaimer by whoever's hosting, or the kittens who are kind of the The do everything, pick up the pieces of the costumes people, those are the kittens. Giving a speech, it's often called the kitten speech, about consent. More and more I'm seeing that even at drag shows, that costume and makeup and even my boobs out on stage, my butt out on stage is not consent, not consent to be groped. And the difference between catcalling and cheering is also something that's gray, but discussed in a lot of kitten speeches. We love to hear things like, woo, yeah, but less so, show me your tits. Like there's a making it about you kind of factor in that. But then in the moment, that's very difficult. I have been in situations where I had an audience member reaching out to grab my butt, and I removed myself from that situation. And admittedly, there was not accountability for that audience member. But my hope is that as a community of people who go to drag shows and go to burlesque shows, that we can hold each other accountable to a higher standard, to bringing consent culture into drag and burlesque. I think that drag and burlesque should be leading examples of consent culture, because we're playing with edges, but we're not violating. And so in the moment, how do we deal with consent violations in drag? Yeah. So yes, my hope is that as a community, we can hold each other as audience members even. And as an audience member, you can hold another audience member accountable if you're sitting next to someone who's yelling out comments or reaching to grope performers. The hope is that we can teach each other and model consent for each other, and that if we reach enough people with our kitten speech in the beginning and bringing consent culture into our communities, that our audiences will be hopefully mostly filled with people who are steeped in consent culture, who can help to educate those who are not, who are making maybe totally honest mistakes, consent violations. What other forms of accountability are there? It's definitely, I think, a really wonderful thing to be in a troupe, or at least to have a community of other performers so that we can hold each other to the highest standards, so that we can support and hold each other accountable. I think that it brings the whole, everyone's level up when we support each other's work and have enough safety and enough trust to hold each other accountable.
Yes, to all of that. So yeah, those kitten speeches, I love that term, kittens. That's so sweet. So seeing those kitten speeches as kind of like a baseline informed consent to try and bring everybody else on board to like all of the implicit norms that are in that community and in that space. And then hoping that the community itself is like open and friendly and accountable to each other enough to like bring new people up to speed and to like call out the person that's maybe a bit too drunk and like being over the top, or like I imagine that like ultimately there's hard lines of like you're getting dragged out of there for this kind of behavior.
And that's often up to the venue, and selecting a venue for drag and burlesque. That's another huge piece. Selecting a venue that is safe, that has values that are in accordance with your own. A venue that will remove someone who needs to be removed. which is absolutely not always the case. And working with producers who will understand if you need to walk off of a performance because you're being harassed, you should be able to walk out of a performance because you're being harassed. I've heard issues of performers not getting paid because, they were groped on stage and they left stage. And then,
Yeah, we're kind of seen as like not fulfilling a contract.
yeah, we're seen as not fulfilling a contract. Exactly. So this kind of, these concentric circles keep moving outward. So we're talking about the cast members or the troupe or whoever is the collection of performers that night holding each other accountable, and then the audience and the venue itself. I want to infiltrate every level with consent culture and with consent, at least consent basics, basic consent education. That's a goal of mine, is to bring consent education to the nightlife here in my local DC, because we're doing okay. We have had some reckonings and there's been some accountability within our communities, but there's so much room for education. There's so much room to come together as DC queer culture, as DC nightlife, as DC restaurant industry. There could be a huge reckoning for the restaurant industry, but that is a whole other conversation as someone who worked in the restaurant industry for a long, long time. But nightlife is a place where I think it's just ripe for consent education. I think it's just ready for it. It's young, excited people like us who want to bring consent education into our communities.
Oh man. So yeah, you mentioned that piece around capitalism and how just when we move out that concentric circle, that's kind of like the biggest one, I think, that shapes our culture at large right now. And yeah, when we already have that coercive element there of we need to get paid in order to survive, within our smaller spheres where we have more control, we have to live up to those consensual ideals, because if we don't do that in the spheres that we have control over, how can we even resist against something that's so coercive on a grander level? So yeah, that's very good to hear that there's pushback against that of you should not have to deal with non-consent in order to get paid. That should be a base standard for sure in all kinds of customer and service industries, whether that's entertainment or food and hospitality. We can reach that level. I feel like that would be great.
And I see my small DC community, and DC is vibrant. There's so much more to DC than Capitol Hill. I like to say there are two DCs. There's the city of DC, and then there's the political world of DC. And the two blur just a little at the edges. This much overlap. But there's this vibrant heartbeat in DC, and I would be so excited to bring consent education into more spaces, into more of our going out life, our nightlife.
That's very exciting. What do you want people to know about consent in general? I was asked this question on this stream once. Yes. What do I want my legacy to be around consent education? And I was like, oh, it's a huge question. And also makes me think about death and aging. And I kind of love that, but it was very intense all of a sudden. Yes. So I'm gonna take the intensity a bit out of that, what's just your one thing that it can be more than one, I will give you that,
Sure.
that you want people to think of like, Amelia really taught me this about consent and I'll never forget it. So like, thank you. No pressure.
No pressure. Consent is fundamental to human interaction. We affirm and deny consent all the time, every day, in all of our interactions. And if I could just get people to zoom out a little bit and see consent woven through daily interaction, I think that would make a tremendous difference. That tiny step in mindfulness from consent being what it was to me growing up, a legal and a medical term, to a term that people apply to their everyday interactions outside of just sex. That would be a huge success if I could implant that in a couple of minds,
Mm-hmm. It is a fundamental that has like so many cascading effects. I feel like you were saying, wanting to be an intervention point within your troupe, within the audience, within the venue, like wanting to be that intervention point to greater culture change. I think you're hitting the nail on the head with starting with a fundamental. And like, if I can just get that into a few people, it will definitely have cascading effects in culture long term. So kudos to you. This has been a super awesome conversation. I have very much enjoyed this. Thank you to the people hanging out and watching us. The P Phantom, hello, hi, and Alex1245. Appreciate you popping in.
Cool.
Do you have any closing words for us, Amelia?
I think it's cool that a couple people were watching and that I got to say something like consent is fundamental. Consent is in everything we do. I think that, like you said, the cascading effect is what I'm seeking, that little perspective shift. I'm excited to be a part of it. I'm excited to be a part of the Consent Academy. Thanks so much for talking with me. It's always fun to talk about drag. By the way, my drag name is Lord Henry. I never said that. Lord Henry is a character from A Picture of Dorian Gray, which is the Oscar Wilde novel. He is the bad influence on Dorian Gray. So that's a bit of my dandy persona. So yes, Lord Henry, that's me. Yeah, I think that's what I got.
My co-director, Ariana, I know that they have played a dandy and role played as a dandy before. I'm going to have to link you two together to talk about that more. That's a fantastic drag name. I'm also very excited to have you on board. Keep an eye out for Amelia teaching some classes one day soon, hopefully. And yeah, appreciate you all coming. Appreciate you so much, Amelia, for answering my questions.
Thanks so much, Asha.
Yeah. Have a good night, everybody. Bye.